All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. And welcome, actually, on behalf of Harvard Law School and the Charles Hamilton Institute and the Criminal Justice Institute, I want to welcome you to the Forum on Criminal Justice featuring the candidates for Attorney General. My name is Delia Umuna. I am the Deputy Director here at Harvard Law School of the Criminal Justice Institute. And today I am standing in for David Harris, who's the Deputy Director for the Charles Hamilton Institute. I also teach a class here at the law school on mass incarceration and its effects on prisons and parole. And I was sharing with Jean and Rahsaan earlier that I just finished a trial which ended yesterday with not guilty verdicts, actually fifth trial since April 10th, so I am exhausted. But I am happy to be here and happy to welcome you to our law school. Hopefully we are taking very good care of you. I can see by your many trips over to that table that we are taking very good care of you. Okay, excellent. Glad to hear it. As you know, today marks the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court outlawed segregation in our schools. And across the country today, people, of course, are reflecting on the current state of educational opportunities for children of color. And although we've made some progress, and at least recently the Supreme Court has told us that we've made complete progress, I think that today's forum will help us shed light on what the candidates really intend to do, at least focus on when it comes to the state of our schools. As a practitioner and an attorney, and especially in juvenile court, I get to see the effects of what inequality still amongst our students, it's still a problem. And I get to see this because of the lack of resources that we see in our urban schools especially. And it's also a problem when we spend a lot more money building prisons than we do investing in our schools. We still have a problem. We still have a problem in terms of inequality of resources and investment when it comes to our children. To help direct the rest of the forum, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you our co-sponsor, Professor Jean Trustin, who's a professor of humanities at Middlesex Community College. Jean, thank you so much for co-sponsoring this event, and I'm going to hand it over to you to take it from here. Thank you very much. Please welcome Professor Trustin.
Thank you. I will be very brief. I just want to say that Middlesex Community College is, this is the second forum that we have co-sponsored with the Institute. We co-sponsored the Governor's Forum, and from my president, Carol Cowan, we are honored to be here. Interestingly enough, there's another forum that the candidates are going to be engaged in at Middlesex on Monday, but this is a criminal justice forum. And to that end, we are all very interested to hear positions, to ask some questions, and to get some answers that are a little bit beneath the surface. As I said last time, we really don't want sound bites. We really want to know what people are going to do. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Rahsaan Hall, and I will also not spend your time with him except to say it is an honor to have him be our moderator. He is the Deputy Director of the Massachusetts Lawyer Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, and I'm sure he will challenge our candidates. Rahsaan.
Thank you very much, Jean. Can you all hear me? You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? All right, I'll just project my voice. You'll notice that in my in the information that's included, it shows that I have a Master's of Divinity degree from Andover Newton Theological School. I am also a preacher, so as in certain circles that I travel, they say use your preaching voice. So I will endeavor to use my preaching voice this evening, as the mic can pick up the rest. Well, good evening and welcome to all, and welcome to our candidates. I've had an opportunity to speak briefly with Senator Tolman, and he said that I can refer to him as Warren. So good evening, Warren. And although I know Assistant Attorney General Maura Healey, I also know her as Maura, but for the purposes of tonight, how would you prefer that I refer to you?
More.
More, okay. All right. As Jean laid out in the introduction, this is a criminal justice forum, and so that we are going to ask their candidates to provide 3 to 5 minute responses to each of the questions that are asked, and we will alternate between candidates on the particular issues. I will, at certain points, interject with additional questions or follow-up questions, and then about 45 minutes into the forum, we'll open up the questions for the audience. And I would just make one request, and I'll remind you of this request again, that this is an opportunity to hear from the candidates. So if there is a particular issue that you are very passionate about, ask a question about the particular issue as opposed to make a speech or statement or share your grand thesis on whatever that particular issue is. And again, I will remind us as we get to that point in tonight's forum. So I will begin with Warren, the first question, and then Maura, you'll have an opportunity to provide your response as well. The legislature has just passed and the governor has pledged to sign a new law to prevent the shackling of pregnant women in our prisons and jails. It bars the use of restraints of any kind during labor and significantly limits the use of restraints during transportation of pregnant women and during post-delivery recovery. How would you, as Attorney General, support the implementation of this law, monitor officials' faithfulness to it, and ensure compliance and respond to suits against the Department of Corrections where abuse has been alleged, such as the incident in Bridgewater State Hospital?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rahsaan. Thank you, Jean. And Jillian, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And a couple updates. The governor actually signed that bill this week. It's now the law of the land, and it is in the process of being implemented, and that's a good day. It's unfortunate that it took us to 2014 to pass that law. But sometimes the wheels up on Beacon Hill move all too slowly, and I think this is an instance where that is the case. If I were Attorney General, I will tell you a number of things that we need to do with respect to this specific legislation, as well as generally and more topically the issue of dealing with individuals like some of the stories we've heard from Bridgewater. Specifically, we have a real problem with our police training budgets in Massachusetts. We are the 3rd lowest in the country for police training. You need to look at the incident that happened up in New Hampshire last week where the police officer was killed. In Massachusetts, police officers are trained to respond to a domestic violence call with 2 officers, not 1. That individual was 4 minutes ahead of the next police officer there. Training is an important component. We want our police to know how to respond to specific situations, whether they be the type of shackling situations that were ridiculously, that they were still allowed to go forward in 2014, domestic violence initiatives, and also correction officers who don't know and haven't been trained how to deal with someone who has a mental illness. As in the Bridgewater situation. Some of the correction officers I have read were informed that they did not know, were actually not aware whether the individual was there as a prisoner or there because of they were being detained because of their mental illness. And obviously you want to treat individuals in all, whatever the situation, appropriately, but where you think that someone is a threat to other correction officers because of their background, because they were engaged in violent crime and the like. It's a totally different situation where someone has a mental illness and a substance abuse. Upwards of 80% of the individuals in our prison system today have a mental illness or a substance abuse. because of overcapacity and a whole range of other issues, our jails in Massachusetts are roughly at 133% of capacity. We're not dealing with underlying issues. Nor are we dealing, by the way, with the need to rehabilitate and train some of the individuals before they go back out into society. 97% of our prisoners are going to be in society, so only 3% are going to remain there. So we need to really reform the way we look at the system, and it's a holistic approach that starts with better training, but also has to be there has to be a significant reform with the way we treat individuals that are involved in the criminal justice system, from the way we target arrests, the way we make arrests, the way we then put people in custody and place them or not on bail, allow them when we put them in the prisons, the way we treat them in the prisons, and whether we give them the proper counseling that they need, and then whether we give them any retraining, and then the parole process, as well as, frankly, the Corey system. In my view, the whole system needs to be reformed, different components of each part. I hope we'll get to talk about those elements as we go forth.
Okay. Maura.
Yeah, I got to say, I find it absolutely appalling that we had, up until just this week, a law on the books that allowed the state to shackle women. I mean, it's abhorrent, it's archaic. I'm offended by it. I'm glad we're where we're at. Certainly as Attorney General, I'll make sure that we don't see those kinds of practices. But I think there's a larger issue when it comes to women in particular. Right now, we do so poorly by women when it comes to care and custody. Framingham is the one location. It's very overcrowded. This gets to issues about the state's lack of seeming interest in integrating and making it easier for families and women in particular, particularly new mothers, young mothers, to maintain contact with family members or children on the outside. To me, this is integral to rehabilitation and to successful reintegration. And so I know, that's why in my plan on criminal justice reform, I'm a huge proponent of easing the connections, physical and otherwise, between those who are incarcerated and family members on the outside. I feel that's really, really important. But, I guess my first response is, what are we doing to keep people out of the criminal justice system in the first place? I think that's where we need to start. Certainly, for those who do bad things to people, there is an important role for public safety. I understand. But, what I think we need to be doing is ending mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses. We need to be heavily investing resources in alternative forms of incarceration, diversion, treatment for mental health, treatment for drug abuse. I mean, 60% of the women who are in custody today have mental health issues, 3 times the rate of men. Let's start there and figure out, where they should be. Jail is the wrong place. I think most sheriffs around this state would tell you that their jails have become increasingly detox centers for those with drug issues or those with mental health issues. On the mental health issue, people with mental health issues who haven't been charged with a crime, let alone convicted of a crime, do not belong in Bridgewater. That's just wrong. And they certainly don't belong in the care and custody of corrections officers, folks who have never been trained on how to deal with those who have mental health issues. It's why I'm for looking at expanding resources for mental health, including opening up beds. We've closed some state facilities where, frankly, this is where people should be going for long-term care if they present with such desperate mental health needs. I mean, that poor young man in Bridgewater and his family, that's terrible. That's terrible, and I don't want to see that happen again. Look, as Attorney General, you have an ability as the state's lawyer to intercede with state agency counsel, I believe, and I want to do that. I want to be a very proactive Attorney General who is proactively engaged with the Department of Corrections. If Department of Corrections is sued, I will be the first to make sure that the folks in the AG's office take a hard look at the facts and make determinations about what happened and do right under the law and under civil rights law. I also want to get in there and examine what our current existing policies and practices by DOC, because to the extent we can, on the front end, institute needed reforms there, I'm hoping they'll cut down and reduce the number of lawsuits we see based on improper and unlawful conduct within that system. So those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much for both of the candidates on that initial question. And at some point, I will allow you all to ask each other questions as follow-up on some of the responses that have been given thus far. I'll move on to the next question, and particularly, Maura, you just spoke to this somewhat. Martha Coakley vigorously supported passing what is colloquially referred to as a 3 strikes law. Do you support the recent expansion of the habitual offender statutes? And if so, why? And if not, do you see ways in which the Attorney General can work to limit their use in some way?
I think that there's a real opportunity for leadership. You know, I started after I left a career at Hale & Dorr and happily took the 70% pay cut to join the AG's office. My job in that office was chief of the Civil Rights Division. And so I come from that perspective to this conversation today. And I believe that the Attorney General can really lead on this issue and has a unique ability to bring people together to lead on criminal justice reform. It is what I want to do as Attorney General. I think that judges should be given, when it comes to sentencing, judges should be given flexibility. Flexibility to look at the facts and circumstances of each matter before her to make determinations. And I think that when it comes to statutes like habitual offender statutes, I want to proactively work with prosecutors to train. In the same way that police need training, I want to make sure that prosecutors are trained so that there isn't profiling going on, so that there isn't abuse or misuse of prosecutorial discretion. One of the things I've called for is more active engagement by the Attorney General in some of the ongoing commissions and task forces that have been set up to look at criminal justice reform. I'm a big data person. I look at numbers. And, you know, if I see district attorney's offices with inordinate number of prosecutions in a given direction, I'm going to be taking a hard look to make sure that we are stopping profiling. Whether it comes to policing practices or whether it comes to prosecutorial decisions, it's really important that we have and that people have faith and belief in the system. So, you know, that's where I am on that issue. But I think it's really important that there is discretion, both with respect to charging and sentencing, and habitual offender laws. You know, they're the ones that you can exercise with discretion. I just want to make sure that prosecutors are exercising the appropriate discretion. I don't support 3 strikes. I mean, you look at California, I think that we've seen what's happened there. I know, you know, I had people come before me when I was doing fair housing work, and you see the impact of what happens to a family when their breadwinner or their father or their brother is taken from the home, and what that means and what that results in for the family. So I think that, you know, we need to be really mindful of the larger picture when it comes to laws like that.
And Maura, just as a follow-up, you mentioned paying close attention to the types of prosecution that's happening and whether or not there are any disparities. Now, people in these counties elect their officials, and so they want to see the people that they elected do the job that they elected them to do. What specifically would you as Attorney General do if you notice these disparities either in prosecution or the discretionary charges that are being brought forward, particularly around some of the minimum mandatory charges?
Well, I'm going to expose it, and I'm going to call them into the office and get an understanding of what it is that led to that, and make sure that the right practices and policies are put in place so that that doesn't happen again. I think training on the front end is really important. I think training for police, I think training for prosecutors, I think training for judges, both with respect to intentional bias but unconscious bias. It's something we talk about a lot in different contexts, jobs, housing, and the like. And certainly when it comes to criminal justice, we need to train and raise awareness of unconscious bias. So that's the first thing. But certainly, if I see data that reveals disparities, the Attorney General is going to investigate and look into it and take action to eliminate those disparities, and that may mean coming down on certain departments or district attorneys' offices that don't have the right policies or practices in place to prevent unnecessary disparities.
Okay. Warren, I'll give you the option of either responding to what Maura just said or answering the initial question, which is, do you support the expansion of these habitual offender statutes, and if so, why? And in which ways would you, as Attorney General, work to limit their use?
And I'll take a whack at both of them, if that's okay.
That's
all right. First off, there are disparities. I don't need to see any more data. I don't need to look to research. I don't need to analyze anything else. If someone that looks like Rahsaan is 8 times more likely to be incarcerated in Massachusetts than someone that looks like me. Someone who's Latino is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than someone who looks like me. There are some serious problems with the way we administer our justice. There's some problems with the way we target crimes. I remember debating on the floor of the Senate the driving while black issue. And the fact that if you were an African American driving a car, you were more likely to be pulled over. It's still an issue. It's not an issue everywhere, but it is still very much an issue. The most prominent person in Massachusetts, Governor Patrick, will tell you about his walks from Milton Academy when he was a young man to Milton Center, and what transpired more times than not when he was stopped by police routinely because undoubtedly the way he looked. It's still a problem in 2014, and to deny it is just wrong. So what do we do about it? Well, first off, we have to make sure that we get the empirical data so that when we look at some of these issues and go after a particular municipality or a district attorney or what have you, that it is clearly out of line in what he or she does, that we have everything in order. And we have to make sure that the laws are applied appropriately, and frankly, that we have laws which reflect the values in 2014. The people of Massachusetts think we punish, in a recent survey, we punish more than we ought to. The criminal justice system is not doing its job with regard to rehabilitating our inmates. So we need to do a better job, both in terms of selecting how we punish and how we go after people, as well as when they are incarcerated, if they get to jail, to make sure that we have programs in place to help them hopefully become better members of society when they get out, as 97% of them inevitably will. And frankly, we need to do a better job dealing with the underlying issue of mental health and substance abuse and the opiate scourge that's afflicting all of our communities that we're not addressing. With regard to the mandatory minimum question, we got into the overcrowding of the prison situation because everybody wanted to be, not everybody, but certain people wanted to be tough on crime. And 12 years ago when I ran for governor, I talked about repealing mandatory minimums. It wasn't quite as popular today as it is today. But when you have Oklahoma and you have South Carolina and you have Alabama and you have Texas and you have all these other states that are going down this path, that are reducing the pressures on their prisons, then we ought to be doing the same thing. We should have, frankly, as we celebrate the 10th year anniversary of being able to marry whoever you love in Massachusetts, where we did lead the country, we ought to be doing a better job leading the country on criminal justice reform in 2014. We ought to be able to look at the question of mandatory minimums, Rahsaan, and say, no, it doesn't make sense. They aren't working. Let's repeal mandatory minimums, particularly right off the bat, no questions asked. I think Maura and I both agree for nonviolent drug offenders, no questions asked. And let's continue to get down the path and look for other ways where we can reduce the pressures on the system. Why don't we look at alternatives, sentencing more? Why don't we look at ankle bracelets and GPS monitors and drug testing and increased use of drug courts for individuals that are arrested and have a drug problem? They ought to be treated differently. There are 19 now. The next budget, I think, proposes increasing that by 5. That's a good step in the right direction. We ought to have more veterans courts. in Massachusetts. So there are a lot of things that we can do, Rahsaan, that make a lot of sense, but pounding our chests and saying we want to be tough on crime hasn't worked, and it isn't working, and it's not going to work. Let's change the direction of our criminal justice approach.
And just to follow up with, or you have a follow-up question?
Well, I had a comment because I realized I did not answer your question, and I'm sorry. You asked if I would support the expansion of, habitual offender laws. The answer to that is no. I think we got plenty of laws on the books, and we don't need more laws, and I certainly don't support expansion as I see it. One of the things that I am a big proponent of when it comes to data is data collection, and this is an area where, as AG, I want to lead on. It's in my plan. We got to collect this data. We got to track this data, and the same way I use data to bring the first civil rights case the state brought against a subprime lender, looking at data, I won't be afraid to bring a case and get after the problem when I see data that speaks to disparities that aren't justified, and that result from problematic practices, either with regard to policing or prosecution or sentencing. So I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I just want to be clear on that.
All right. And to follow up, so I think it's clear that neither are in favor of expansion and are certainly open to looking at alternatives. But to the extent that there is any proposed legislation to eliminate minimum mandatories or to significantly reduce them more than they have already been reduced, Warren, would you be in support of an initiative or any proposed legislation that came forward as Attorney General?
Yes, absolutely, unequivocally. I've driven a public policy agenda up in Beacon Hill. I've served in the House. I've served in the Senate. I have many friends. I know how to get things done. I took on big tobacco when long before it was popular, when you were smoking in buildings like this, and it was a very difficult battle. Big tobacco was big tobacco at the time I took them on, and I showed that they could be beaten. Rush Limbaugh attacked me on national radio, called me an anti-smoking Nazi. That's how I knew I was doing something right, Rahsaan. But I didn't shy away from that battle. I took on campaign finance and ethics reform. Probably the toughest piece of legislation to get through on Beacon Hill is reforming the campaign finance and ethics laws on the very individuals that have to vote on the measure. I did that because I was a skilled person who could drive a public policy agenda in a meaningful way. As the chief law enforcement officer of the Commonwealth, Rahsaan, one will bring a great deal of credibility to this issue. And I've never been shy about taking on, unpopular causes, and even some of them before their time. I sponsored the Domestic Partnership Initiative on behalf of this city and on Boston long before it was popular. Criminal justice reform, however, is popular. The problem we have is we have certain people saying, oh, no, you can't do this, you can't reform it. I want to, as the chief law enforcement officer, bring the credibility that I will bring to this issue and say and make the case, not to be a supporter of this. I want to be the driving force behind this movement on Beacon Hill. I talked about it 12 years ago when I ran for governor. Its time has come. We're following other states. It's more humane. It's going to cost less money. By the way, we're paying $47,000 roughly for an inmate in Massachusetts. Why don't we take some of that money, put it towards substance abuse and mental health counseling that these individuals need, put it towards work training, workforce reentry programs, and reduce the pressure on the prisons right now, where you have them at overcapacity, so they don't have an ability to serve those people who should be incarcerated. And by the way, Maura's right about Framingham. It's a disaster. If you're held on bail in Massachusetts and you're a woman, there's only one place you end up, and that's Framingham. And because it is an open prison system, that means that everybody, you could be in there, an indigent defendant on a low bail, on a relatively minor crime that gets thrown in with the rest of the population in a dangerous situation. That's a real problem in Massachusetts for women that are involved in the criminal justice system, and that ought to be one of the very, very first things we address in next year, and it certainly will be if I'm Attorney General.
Warren, you can keep the mic. One of the initiatives that has been discussed in the past, there was the laws of, I'm drawing a blank, in 2000 that required municipalities to record racial profiling data. And there was a subsequent, in 2010 and 2011, initiative by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz and Representative Byron Rushing to renew that collection of motor vehicle stop data. It did not get very far. There was not full support by the current Attorney General. And so what is your stance on that? If it comes up again, would you support it? And particularly in response to police officers, police chiefs, organizations who push back saying it's an economic burden to our municipality to be required to gather this data.
Okay. Well, first off, I'm going to tell everybody about a little debate that Maura and I are privately having right here, and that is whose campaign will think forward enough and get us some more water, because both of us are low on water, and I'm sure Maura's mouth is parched as mine is, so I would certainly appreciate that. Sorry. Secondly, both campaigns got up for the record. So, but with regard to that issue, absolutely, I would support that. If it isn't a problem, we don't have to address it. But if we don't have data and we don't know, and we know that it was a problem. Byron Rushing, by the way, who I serve with in legislation, one of the great leaders on this issue on civil rights, and he's someone that I respect immensely. And thank you, Michael. Now, do I dare drink that? This is Maura's campaign manager. Thank you. We need to do a better job, and we need to get the collection of data. And frankly, some resources will have to be committed to this, Rahsaan, because it ought to be a priority, because it is a real problem. And that the glory of Massachusetts is not all terrific when dealing with some of these issues. And we need to have resources, certainly for communities to be able to do this, but also training for police officers so that they are not inadvertently engaging or advertently engaging in discrimination of any form. So yes, I would certainly support it. I would speak out for it. I would advocate for it, and I would work with Byron and Sonia to get that measure passed.
More?
Thank you. Absolutely. I think that the collection of that information is really important, and I support that legislation. What I also want to advocate, though, for is funding, because funding is necessary to give police departments the ability and the real resources to do this effectively. And I'm willing to use Attorney General resources and not just advocate to the legislature to fund this through the legislation, but I would commit to using Attorney General resources and settlement funds to help further this, because I think that to do it effectively, to do it in a real robust way, it's going to require funding. It does no good to pass it and require it and not fund it. So I'll be a strong advocate for that. And again, the bulk of my work when I was in the Attorney General's office was looking at disparities as civil rights chief in housing, in education, in lending practices, even when it came to bars and restaurants. Just yesterday, the Attorney General's office resolved a case that I filed a year ago against a bar in South Boston that was discriminating against patrons of color. So unconscious bias exists. It's alive and well here and across the country. And we need to do all we can to train people to have it on their radar, to register it, so that they don't then engage in that and engage in practices that result in disparate treatment for people of color. On the mandatory minimum question, I don't know if you wanted me to respond to that, whether I'd support legislation re-examining mandatory minimums. I think absolutely is the answer. But I think and I hope that folks know we need to do a lot more than just that. It's not as simple as repealing mandatory minimums. We really do need to invest in meaningful reintegration and reentry programs. That means life skill building, job training, and not just job training for low-wage work. I mean, real vocational training within the system so that people have skills that they can take with them as they seek to reintegrate. And also continued mental health and drug addiction treatment services. This is all really, really important. And I also want to mention bail reform, something we haven't talked about, but I know of instances where there are people who are sitting in jails simply because they can't afford to make bail. That's not the purpose of bail. That's wrong. We need to fix it. As AG, I will lead on that because that's part of this. I also, want to just say that we need to address some of the collateral consequences of having a record. I understand. I mean, we had people in fair housing cases who got evicted from publicly subsidized housing because they came out with a quarry. We've done some quarry reform. I don't think it's been enough. It's still very hard to get a job, get a loan, start life. So, it's not just one thing, mandatory minimums. It's a whole series of things that I think we need to do comprehensively and holistically to be able to realize meaningful criminal justice reform.
I want to go back a little bit to when you were talking about advocating for funding and even using Attorney General resources for funding. There's this concern among civil rights and civil liberties advocates that the overfunding and over-militarization of municipal police has become a problem. And so what, if anything, would you do as Attorney General to stem the tide of the over-militarization of municipal police? You see, the leftovers from military campaigns showing up in neighborhoods under the auspices of Shannon grants and other types of funding. And so, as you mentioned that you would advocate for more funding, how do you distinguish between funding for racial profiling data collection as opposed to increasing the militarized impact or the military impact of the police or increased surveillance of certain communities?
Well, I think you're talking about funding the right things. What are your priorities? And my priorities are to fund things like education and training. I train police on identifying and responding to hate crimes. I train police on identifying and responding to LGBT victims of crime. And on other situations. We know that some training is being piloted on how to better respond to those with mental health issues. You're never going to go wrong by training, by giving people information and knowledge which they can then use to do their job well. And I think they're open to that and want that. So, that's when I talk about funding, it's just a matter of priorities. That's where I want funding to go. I want funding to go to more programs like Youth Connect. In Boston, it's a partnership, Boston Police Department and youth in the city. After school programming, other activities and engagement, things that are going to really work in the community, I believe, in positive ways to reduce crime and social disruption, and build greater bonds of trust between the community and law enforcement. Those are the kinds of investments I'm talking about, in addition to, the other investments I've talked about when it comes to mental health services and real treatment for drug abuse and drug addiction.
Maura, you want to respond to that?
Thanks. So I guess if you're talking about certain devices, surveillance on law-abiding citizens, or toys, quote-unquote toys that are never used by police departments. Sure, we all don't want to see those type of wasteful practices, but when we're talking about data collection, we're talking about training. Remember, our police are on a per officer basis at the third from the bottom in terms of police training in the country. I don't think we want to be third from the bottom on anything. And certainly we could do a better job putting more resources in. And frankly, I think we'll have a better, more well-informed police organization throughout the Commonwealth if we do invest in the training. And I will tell you that I'm very proud of my hometown of Watertown and our police. And I live a few hundred yards from where the shooting was on April 19th. I live a few hundred yards from where the boat is and was on April 19th, and The first individual, Officer Joe Reynolds, who followed those, who picked up those terrorists on Mount Auburn Street and prevented the bombing from taking place in Times Square, is someone I wrote his letter of recommendation. And the second guy on the scene is Sergeant John McClellan, is my best friend on the police force. I want to make sure that people like those brave officers who had a 7.5-minute gun battle with these terrorists have the resources that they need to fight. I had the SWAT team come through my house. And they were very kind about it and very nice about it. And I had the police and the police dogs in my house, in my backyard that day, and it was, it was quite a day, as you can imagine. But I will tell you that I was glad that I was living in a place where we had resources amongst our police department out there, as my children were quite concerned, and our whole neighborhood was concerned about what was transpiring. It was a harrowing experience. I know that there were some things that were overplayed that day, and there were some mistakes certainly made, but at the end of the day, I was proud of the way my community of Watertown responded, and certainly the way my police, the people in the Watertown Police Department responded. I'm very proud of them.
So Warren, you touched on a very interesting topic, and it's the reality of the personal experience that you had being so close to such tragic incidents, and an appreciation for the law enforcement aspect of it. But how do you juxtaposition that up against the integrity of privacy rights?
Well, that's going to be an ongoing battle, both in terms of that. Now, first of all, when the police came to my house, first of all, you see them coming. There's literally 20 SWAT team people coming up the street. It's my 15-year-old daughter and I were watching as they came up. And as they came up the walkway, I naturally opened the door. That's another story, but because I pulled the door too hard, and the door sort of made a loud noise, and they both stopped and pointed their guns at me, and a pretty intimidating situation. But when they came up to my front door, they're soaking wet. You might remember it was a warm day, not unlike today. They were drenched, a couple guys, and there were several people. I had watched them go around, they surround the house, and they said, "How is everything?" And they were very courteous, very kind, and they said, look, we're going door to door. We'd like to search your house. If you don't want us to come through, we certainly won't. It's totally up to you. And I said, look, we're fine on the first floor and the second floor, but nobody's been downstairs all day. If you want to check the basement, that's fine. They were great, and they went down my basement. You hear them door open right, you see the guns turn. It's pretty intimidating to see it happen in your house and to see the guys around. Now, that's the balance. Now, if I had said no, as some people did, my belief is that they wouldn't have come in, and my privacy rights would have been protected. But there is a larger privacy issue that's out there. Do we need license plate scanners out in society? Should police be able to utilize them for nonviolent offenses? Should there be private utilization of license plate scanners? How long should they be maintained? Those are all, Rahsaan, legitimate inquiries into the issue of privacy versus the integrity of going after terrorists and the like. I err on the side of privacy, on maintaining one's civil liberties and their right to their protection to privacy. And particularly for private drones or private license plate scanners, I would be supportive of some increased utilization of the wiretap law, but only for violent. Right now, the wiretap law in Massachusetts, which hasn't been updated since 1968, is allowed for organized crime, very narrow. I would consider increasing it for violent crimes with guns, very narrow increase of the authorization for wiretap law. For me, the personal liberty and the right to privacy is very, very important, and we need to protect that so that no law-abiding citizen in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has to worry about their rights being violated at any time by people who are supposed to be protecting them. I get concerned that some police chief who has a vendetta against some other family and tries to, go after some kid for some minor drug offense to utilize the tools of the police department far beyond what they were anticipated for. I don't want to see that happen. So I think we need to be very, very vigilant, Rahsaan, in this area, particularly in light of some of the other things that we've discussed and the way that law can sometimes be utilized in a manner far beyond what we would anticipate it to be done appropriately.
Thank you. Maura, you want to comment on that briefly?
I mean, to me, it's pretty simple. We have a U.S. Constitution, we have a Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, we have many years of case law. I think the line is clear, and if prosecutors or police or anyone else in law enforcement crosses that line, I'll take action as AG. You know, these are not mutually exclusive prerogatives. Protecting liberty, respecting privacy, and ensuring public safety. And we've seen instances, sure, where law enforcement has crossed that line. But as AG, it will be my responsibility to make sure that I am attentive to not just concerns of public safety, but the predominant rule of the Constitution and the Declaration of Rights, and I think it's set out pretty clear there.
Thank you. This will be my last question, and then I'll open it up to questions from the floor. And this last question, Maura, you can answer this first. What legislation would you file or seek in order to turn your campaign promises into actual laws?
Well, you know, the good news is that there's currently a pretty robust debate going on in the legislature right now on involving some issues of criminal justice reform, and folks like Senator Jamie Eldridge, Senator Stan Rosenberg, both of whom have endorsed me, are actively engaged in that. So I'm paying attention to what's happening in real time right now in the remainder of the legislative session. So I want to see where we are come July once that concludes, and then I'll better know what I need to take up or will want to take up as Attorney General. But certainly addressing mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses, reforming bail, and making sure that we don't have people who are in jail simply because they can't afford to pay. I want to do something that's not by legislation, but something that I think I can just do as Attorney General, and that is, let's lower the cost of phone calls for those in custody. It is a civil rights violation for them and for their families. It is absolutely unacceptable. I want to do things like sit with our next governor and DOC commissioner to talk about visiting hours, to talk about changes to policies and practices that can ease integration between family members and those in custody, so that people have a more viable chance of success when they get out. Because there are a lot of things I think we can do as a matter of just changing practice and policy. Let's expand the use of drug courts, mental health courts, veterans courts, to the extent they're working and they're really helping people. Let's do things like support community corrections programs and alternatives to incarceration. I don't think that you need legislation to do that. I think that you need an advocate, and you need to bring together partners, and you need to lead on making that happen. We've got some great pilot programs out there. I mean, Sheriff Garvey, Sheriff Donlan, both of whom are supporting me, understand this and have, piloted some really terrific programs. A lot more work to be done, but these are the kinds of things we should be doing. And look, to the extent we need legislation to fund things, whether it's mental health services or drug addiction treatment, I'll be the first next door at Beacon Hill advocating for those things. I also will be willing to use AG settlement funds from cases that we bring, and resources in the office to help support and fund those initiatives. So those are just some ideas. And again, I'm watching very carefully what's happening with the reform efforts in the legislature.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a whole host of issues about which we need to work on. I served on the Criminal Justice Committee when I was in the legislature, and it's very important that we address some of these concerns. In addition to more drug courts and more courts for veterans, I would also look to have domestic violence crime courts, so that these courts are used to making a woman feel welcome and not threatened in a situation where her very life is imperiled. So having specialized courts that deal with that would help in those situations. I would also, specifically with regard to the domestic violence issue, is institute a no-drop policy and seek for that to become the law, whereby what invariably all too often happens is where there is a domestic violence complaint, eventually the battered woman will sometimes drop the charges against her batterer, and by not allowing for a drop policy, and so that the district attorneys can look to see if there are other ways to pursue the specific issues that are involved with regard to domestic violence. We would encourage that case to be pursued. That can save lives. It's done in a number of other states. There's no reason why we can't do it here. Again, I would repeal the mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenders. I would work, Rahsaan, quite tirelessly to increase funding for mental health and substance abuse treatment, both for people outside the prison system as well as for people inside the system. I would also look to reform the way we use the bail system. Specifically, we take into account the risk of flight. We don't weigh appropriately, in my opinion, the risk of dangerousness to society. And there are some instances where individuals are not at risk of dangerousness, but they can't afford the $150 bail that's set. So they sit and languish in jail for days and weeks and sometimes months on minor offenses. And we need to be cognizant of that in the 21st century. I think we need to look at Corey. I don't think Corey reform is done. I think we still have work to do. The governor did some good stuff there in terms of reducing the look-back provisions, but I think there's further things we can do. I want to see better job training in our prisons. Specifically, there's a great program. I don't know if any of you subscribe to the American Prospect, but this month's edition talked about a great program in California where they actually trained inmates to become underwater divers so that they could be very specialized and look at bridges underwater, and very well-paying, by the way, job, but train inmates. The average rate of recidivism in the California state prisons is 67%. For individuals who complete this program, it's 6%, okay? 10 times more effective. 6 out of 100 people that complete this program are going back to jail, 94 are not. That saves money. That makes sense. We ought to be looking for more programs like that, copying what other states do and incorporating those programs. That's a home run in terms of cost savings in every way possible. The data collection piece that you talked about, I'd work with Byron Rushing and Senator Sonia Chang Diaz to do that. There's a whole range of different things that we need. I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to be active. I'm going to work on this because we can be more humane. We can be smarter on crime, and we can also save money at the same time. It's a big win for the Commonwealth.
Okay, thank you very much. And so at this point, we're going to open it up to the audience. Again, the reminder is that this is an opportunity to ask questions, and because of the lateness of the hour, I'm going to ask that the candidates both keep their responses within 1 minute to 2 minutes.
Thanks
Yes,
for coming. Could you please distinguish the main differences between both of you in any of your policies or issues around criminal justice reform? What do you both see as the main difference that you would have between both of you as Attorney General in these areas?
Thank you. Maura?
Well, I think both of us have put out criminal justice reform plans, and certainly encourage anyone and everyone to consider and review those. You know, my experience in coming to this, I come to this as a civil rights lawyer. I come to this having studied disparities, having litigated discrimination, having tried to use law and my skills as a lawyer to get at issues of discrimination. And I've done it in housing, jobs, lending, education. Actually, one of the first things I worked on with the Charles Hamilton Houston was when the use of voluntary race integration plans in schools was challenged here. And today is the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And and we won that that case a while back here in Massachusetts. So, that's something I bring to this is having grappled with these issues, and I know how to combat them. I also have had extensive experience working with police and district attorneys while in the Attorney General's office, and I believe that I can be the person who can lead, bring together people on this issue, and move us to where we need to be on criminal justice reform. I know I can't do it alone as Attorney General, but I know what it takes to get it done, and I'll be there ready to deliver.
Okay, Maura?
Sure, Norma, I think it's about leadership. It's about someone who's willing to take on tough stands, be heard, and drive a public policy agenda in a forceful way, as I've done on Beacon Hill before, as I stood up when I ran for governor in 2002 as the only clean elections candidate, knowing that it was an uphill battle, but doing it because it's right. That is why I bring such passion to the issue of criminal justice reform, because I know it's overdue, I know it makes sense, and I know it's about my sense of justice and fairness. And I will advocate in a way that I think most people won't do on this issue, and because I'm not afraid of the political ramifications, because I'm not afraid of taking on tough challenges. I've done it before. That's what my life's been about. My first vote in the state Senate representing Cambridge was against Bill Bulger. I voted for a guy named Bill Keating, who's now a congressman. Not because it was an easy thing to do. I didn't have an opponent in the race. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because it made sense. And that's what my public life has been about, taking on tough challenges and not being afraid to stand up and drive in a forceful leadership way. That's why all 4 living former attorney generals have endorsed me. Yep. All right. Sorry, Rahsaan. I know there's a bunch of people.
Next question.
These are the 5 people, and that will be it after these.
All right. Thank you, Jean.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I noticed that both of you mentioned Framingham and used words like disaster and overcrowded to describe the state prison for women. And I'd like to hear specifically, what do you think are the policy implications of Framingham being overcrowded? What would you want to do in terms of your agenda as Attorney General? We do have legislation pending right now to build new jails for women, for instance. What are the implications for you of the problems that we have now at the state prison? And as specific as you could possibly be.
In a minute or less.
Yes, a minute or less.
So specifically, I don't want to build new jails. I want to take some existing facilities and enable them to be utilized particularly for women who are there on bail. We should not be incarcerating women in bail in Framingham. And Framingham is one size fits all. And there's a great deal of autonomy and ability to move about in that facility that makes it dangerous, a dangerous place to be. So I think what we need to do is we need to try to have, first off, reduce the overcrowding by getting women who don't need to be in prison out of prison, similar to what we're doing, I hope, with the male population. By reducing that, we're then able to treat better the individuals who are violent offenders who need to be in there, and also reduce the pressure, by the way, on the male facilities, and take some components of some of the male facilities and figure out where we can incarcerate or put people who are there on bail, which makes sense. I know there's a lot to talk about in 45 seconds, but Framingham's a real problem, and it is a disaster.
Maura?
So I think a few things to do. An obvious problem there is that you have women who have all sorts of classifications housed within the same facility. You have women who are sent there from courtrooms when what they really need is a bed. They need mental health services. They need treatment for drug addiction. I think that we need to make a better use of expanding some of the pilot programs where those in DOC custody are stepped down to jails, or work release programs, alternative forms of incarceration. And I think that that's part of this as well. But it's something that I'm really committed to. You'll see that part of my plan actually calls for creating, as Attorney General, a task force to study issues facing women in correctional facilities so that we can really make informed judgments about how best to serve this population.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you both. A Commonwealth magazine not long ago ran a story about the problem of police shootings in Massachusetts and how infrequently they're prosecuted. So I'm wondering if you think that's a problem here. If so, what would you do about it? What could the Attorney General do about it? And not just expand it a little bit, not just police shootings, but if you have a pattern of police abuses, if local prosecutors aren't prosecuting, what can the Attorney General do?
Maura, I'm going to let you ask that one first.
Well, there are a few things that the Attorney General can do. The Attorney General can convene a grand jury, look into the circumstances of any shooting, can open an investigation to understand what led to a particular shooting, and can, I think, work very proactively, not just on the front end proactively, training police, hopefully, so that you are reducing 1983 suits or things that give rise to 1983 suits, civil rights violation suits. But, you know, on the back end, certainly, for any police shooting, I think it bears analysis. The police want to know if they did something wrong, so that it never happens again. And that's my view. I would want that if I was in charge of a police agency or in charge of a district attorney's office or any other law enforcement agency. So as Attorney General, I will look into and be prepared to have teams look into the circumstances of any police shooting so that we can understand if there was improper conduct that led to an innocent person being shot or, worse yet, killed. We've seen those cases. You know, typically if there's a homicide, what happens is the district attorney in the district is there to do the examination, but the Attorney General has great power. The Attorney General can convene an inquest and look into the circumstances beyond that, and I certainly will be open to doing that as Attorney General. This goes to, you know, fundamental issue of people's faith and trust in the system. We're a democracy, it's rule of law, people need to believe in it. They really need to believe and trust in it. I think it's important as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer that I do everything I can to make sure that the public has confidence and faith in the system and those who are out there every day policing.
Okay, Maura.
Wendy, I think the article to which you alluded referred to the police going 72 for 72 in terms of no problems with police conduct. And, you know, I think the short answer to your very real question is we need to make sure that there are procedures in place when these issues transpire, that the procedures are followed. And then, where appropriate, increase reliance on inquests. So that a judge can hold a hearing, can listen to the evidence in a closed courtroom, and find out as best he or she can what transpired. I think sometimes you have district attorneys who have a very close relationship with police departments, unable or unwilling to look closely at the type of conduct that's transpired. The vast majority of police, I think, do their job and do it tremendously, tremendously well. I have no doubt, however, that there are some instances where police get carried away. I don't know that 72 for 72 is the record that reflects what accurately transpired, but I will assure you that if I'm Attorney General, that I will look at these issues, take them very seriously, and where appropriate, look towards the increased utilization of inquests to discern what actually transpired.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Yes, hi. This is a little bit of an out of left field, big picture question. Can you contemplate ever a credentialing system relating to creating a body, a tiered level of legal services so that there are people who are not lawyers who are able to provide legal advice to people either in the criminal realm or in the civil realm?
Warren, I'll let you take that one first.
Sure. On the civil side, one of the things I want to do is increase utilization of the Consumer Protection Division for complaint mediation and dealing with complaints. The number of individuals in the Commonwealth that area served has decreased dramatically over the last 15 years. We know a lot about the treasurer's unclaimed money lists. I don't think enough people know that if the woman in Dorchester gives a painter $5,000 and never sees him again, that she has an advocate in the Attorney General's office and that it should be there for her. So that can be well-trained people who are non-lawyers advocating on behalf of people, on behalf of the Attorney General's office. I did this as a summer intern while I was in college for 2 summers. It was actually where my interest in the law was kindled. I think it's a great program. I think that we don't do a good enough job letting the people of the Commonwealth know that, particularly on the civil side, that there are opportunities for people to be involved and have advocates on their behalf, and that's the type of Attorney General's office I want to run.
Okay, thank you. Maura?
A couple of thoughts. First of all, I support doing anything we can to get somebody help when they're in the legal system, civil or criminal. I think that if you're talking criminal, we have to be really mindful of defendants' due process rights, really important that they have the representation that they're entitled to. I mean, that's what Gideon v. Wainwright was all about. Really important law, making sure that those who were indigent had a right to counsel in criminal proceedings. So I'd have to think that through, how it would work in that context. But certainly would support, advocates, counselors, those who can help with long-term stabilization around housing, employment, drug addiction, mental health, okay? But when it comes to civil, one of the things that I did in the AG's office, we had some settlement funds, and we used them to put together an anti-foreclosure program where we brought people in, not as attorneys, but to work, and we also funded legal services to fund means by which people could get counseling and could get loan modifications from banks. So I've seen it work, and I'd be the first to use it, whether it's in housing court, even in probate and family court, and the like. I certainly would be open to supporting that if it was done in a quality, well-trained way.
Okay, thank you. And last question.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. I'd like to ask you, in light of the United States Supreme Court and Massachusetts Supreme Courts declaring that mandatory life without parole for juveniles is unconstitutional, what do each of you believe is the appropriate treatment for those juveniles, and what steps as Attorney General will either of you take to ensure that juveniles are treated appropriately?
Thank you. Maura, you can go ahead and answer that one first.
Well, when my look at this issue is that young people, juveniles in particular, particularly those who find themselves in DYS custody, have incredibly high rates of recidivism. Obviously, what we're doing is not working. And I'm a big proponent of programs like ROCA over in Chelsea, where they're looking to identify really at-risk youth and get them into programs and services that they need. So hopefully, they don't find themselves embroiled in the criminal justice system, or to the extent they have, that they go down a different path. I think we need to target resources to at-risk youth, targeting resources to programs like Youth Connect or other innovative programs that help stabilize kids. Alternatives to incarceration, certainly, when it comes to juveniles. Education. This means early education, too, because that's also determinative. So I'm a huge proponent there. With respect to the recent Supreme Court decisions and the Massachusetts decision, my job as AG will be to enforce that law. Absolutely. We know what the rule is now. And I think that anything we can do to reduce the number of unnecessary arrests or circumstances in which young people find themselves embroiled in the criminal justice system is a good thing and what we should be doing.
Thank you. Maura?
Sure. So, and I agree that it starts with early childhood education. I led the battle for increased funding for 0 to 6, because we know in large part a child's brain develops in that crucial period of life. I don't think anyone here would disagree with that, and certainly involving it. There's a whole range of great programs that are out there. We want to see increased optimization of all of those programs, public and private. With regard specifically to your question, however, so I understand that there are some individuals who engage in this type of behavior when they're youthful offenders, and the notion that they should be back out on the streets is one that is not welcome to me, frankly. I also recognize that there are people, and certainly the Supreme Court recognizes this decision, who can be rehabilitated. And I think we ought to have that discretion in our system, and that's what the balance that the court was trying to strike. So when I look at this system, certainly I think that we need to further look at some modifications to the existing system. And there's legislation which says that I believe Senator Tarr and Senator Feingold filed some legislation increasing it to 35 years. I'm not sure that's right. I actually would look for some lower component, but also make sure that there's a mechanism in there so that the individual from Somerville, a guy named Eddie O'Brien, who clearly had the sufficient mens rea as an adult, even though he might have only been 17 years old, is still incarcerated because of the heinous crime that he committed on the woman who lived across the street from him. I think striking that balance is very important. Protecting the public and certainly holding people accountable for their actions, while at the same time ensuring that people who committed crimes when they were very young, and now have been rehabilitated, are able to move on with their lives.
Okay.
Thank you both
very much. Let's give the candidates a round of applause. We'd like to thank our hosts and sponsors, the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice and Middlesex Community College, as well as Harvard Law School. So thank you all for coming out for your questions, and make sure you go out and vote.